pleasure to be with you tonight on our panel and for this evening's event. Last year, we marked the 80th anniversary of St. Valery. For the first time as a national commemoration, indeed an international wide commemoration, and more on that later. This year, our efforts to continue to remember the Fighting 51st continues, albeit sadly again, we are convening remotely as a result of continued coronavirus issues and restrictions, albeit easing, still in place. It would have been a real pleasure for the panel to have gathered in Edinburgh to mark the move of brigade headquarters from Stirling to the capital, and the opportunity to wet the baby's head, so to speak, at Redford at the mess. Would have certainly brought us all together as individuals, but would have brought me closer to my main area of research, which is the First World War. Redford Barracks, of course, built around about that era to house the build-up of armies in Old Reekie, as Edinburgh Castle could no longer adequately hold soldiers at that time. Just across from Craig Lockhart, so from Redford, is Craig Lockhart, which is the site of my main research into Wilfred Owen and the First World War poets. As we know, it was only 2 decades later, the world went back to war for a second time, and the horror continued for those who were in the early phases of the war, fighting the German rearmament machine as it ploughed through France. No longer fighting in trenches, the German war machine swung into action, progressing across French soil at speed and vigour. And it takes us to St. Valery, days after Dunkirk, with 51st, along with others, remaining in France to fend off those attacks. Despite the heroic efforts, we know that the 51st were captured largely, and tonight we're going to focus on 3 particular aspects of St. Valery and the Battle of St. Valery. As John says, we're joined by distinguished speakers tonight. Brigadier Charles Grant joined the panel last year, and delighted to have Charles back with us again. Brigadier Grant was commissioned in the Queen's Own Highlanders 1968, commanding officer of different units, including the 51st Highland Brigade. And on leaving the Army as Director of Land Warfare, he took up an appointment as the Chief Executive of Highland Reserve Forces and Cadet Association. He has a long interest in military history, and as we heard before, he manages the 51st Highland Division website. And we'll just repeat the website again for anyone who's logging in late. That can be accessed at 51hd.co.uk. And for anyone who wants to continue research into this area after tonight, I'd highly commend that website as a site of not only an overview of the events, but also a huge array of source material, primary source material, that can be downloaded from that site. So I'd recommend that to you. As well as Brigadier Grant, we welcome Adam Brown. Adam, as you heard, is from the Scottish Military Research Group, a small registered charity who aims to inform the public and educate the public on their Scottish military ancestors. And in many ways, Adam's become a bit of an unsung hero of St. Valery. He's always been interested in military history. He's always been interested in St. Valery's 50th birthday. His wife asked him where in the world he would like to go, and he said St. Valery, and travelled there. So an area of great passion for him. Adam's Twitter feed, for those who follow Adam on Twitter, his biography reads, "I don't like duff history or whataboutery. Facts matter." Now, working with Gordon Barclay, Adam has become a bit of a foot soldier of the truth on social media. The two gentlemen, Gordon Barclay and Adam, continue to engage in civic discourse, but trying to put the wrongs of mythology right, with facts and with evidence, and we'll touch more on that as we go through this evening. The batting order for this evening is as follows. I'm going to open up from a retrospective lens, looking at St. Valery conflict and commemoration, looking at the aspect of the rewriting of history and how we've remembered St. Valery over time. I'm then going to pass to Adam, who is going to go right back into 1940, but he's going to look at it from a wide context. Adam's going to set the scene as an international context. Where does this sit in the grander global strategic picture? And then we'll close the evening with Brigadier Grant talking specifically in St. Valery itself, but this year with a particular leadership lens, looking at the leadership dynamics on the ground in St. Valery and some of the unique challenges of leading as part of a withdrawal. And that will close this evening. As we go through tonight, I'm sure there'll be a number of questions. We'd ask if you either save your question and we'll open into hopefully a lively dialogue and debate after the proceedings, or if you wish to put your question up into the text box that we've been utilising already, and we can draw on those questions in discussion afterwards. Each of the three presentations will last around about 15 to 20 minutes, and that gives us a good half hour of discussion and questions afterwards before we sidle into the weekend evening. So without further ado, we'll kick-start with the commemorations. And St. Valery has been commemorated before. It's important to acknowledge that it has been commemorated before. It's commemorated annually. Indeed, in France itself, it's commemorated daily. We know of one family related to the news story we put out this year, trying to find the identity of one of the fallen in one of the known unto God graves, where French families every day tend to that grave. Right to this day, there's families who are connected to events in 1940, and they look after that grave of what they believe is a Scottish soldier. That in itself is interesting to consider the difference between commemoration in France and commemoration in the UK. I reflect on the commemorations of the First World War period and the difference between the commemorations that there were in France and the commemorations that were in the UK. And I guess in both First and Second World War, what we need to consider is that the Second World War, First World War, was being fought on France. So there's a different resonance with the events, given that the landscape, the environment was where the battle was being fought, and some of the scars of that can still be seen right up until today. St. Valery's commemorated respectfully, reverently, and there's many reasons for that. But initially after the war, it wasn't talked about. And it wasn't talked about for the usual reasons of people want to forget. People don't want to be dragging up memories. People don't want to be talking about a campaign, particularly one which wasn't necessarily a success in some ways. The defeat brings its own dynamic to it. Although we may reflect that in commemorations, we do commemorate things like the first day of the Battle of the Somme as a counter piece to that. Particular commemorations took place in 1990, the 50th anniversary. There was significant commemorations took place, and Adam will touch more on that later in his presentation. But as we approach the 80th anniversary, a few serendipitous events led to the event of St. Valery being commemorated, not just as an event in itself, not just as a nationwide event, but it quickly escalated into international commemoration, engaging all corners of the globe. Now, the events that took us to that point started with an old head teacher friend of mine, John Lowe, John was a head teacher in Perth and Kinross, many secondary schools in Perth and Kinross, an esteemed educator, now retired. And John had worked closely and watched some of the work we were engaged in with First World War commemorations, and he raised with me that his father, Jack Lowe, had been a St. Valery veteran, and that he'd written some particularly poignant poetry in the prisoner of war camps, and he wanted to see how could we bring that to the public attention. Now, we spoke to various parties, including members of the Scottish Parliament, who showed negligible interest at best about bringing this event to the public domain. So, like anything else that needs to be done, form a small committee and just crack on. And that's what we did. We very slowly built a small committee of various representatives. And that started the 80th commemorations. Now, one of the things that moved it significantly was a discussion I had with Malcolm Noble. Malcolm Noble is the chairman of the Royal Caledonian Education Trust, which many of you know was Scotland's Armed Forces children's charity. And Malcolm and I had a discussion about it. He also had relatives who were at St Valery and a particular interest on it. And as 2020 started to turn into the coronavirus nightmare that we all know, we had to think quickly about how do we commemorate St Valery in a very different way. And there was a plan in place, if you like, of a way to commemorate, which we'd used towards the tail end of the First World War commemorations that we decided to utilise here. So at the tail end of the First World War commemorations, I'd written an article in the Times newspaper in November 2017, suggesting with 1 year of commemorations to go, there was a great opportunity to use those commemorations to show that the world could cooperate across borders, and we could do something to show that humanity and civilization have progressed so well 100 years after the world had turned itself apart. There was ways in which we could do things across borders. And as we know, there's only one language which unites us all, and it's a language of music. It's the only language that everyone enjoys, makes, plays together. And we've now, 3 years on the bounce, held concerts on the afternoon of Remembrance Sunday, where musicians in multiple locations have all played the same piece of music at the same time as a symbolic gesture of international cooperation. Now, in that First World War commemoration, we've had USA to Kosovo, we've had from Shetland to South Africa, we've had French and German schools coming together to form orchestras. We had Turkish and Syrian school students played together during the time when those countries were at loggerheads. And we've had musicians in the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea playing music together as part of that initiative. So a strong symbol of what music can achieve. So we decided to try and use music as a means to commemorate St Valery. And we had an absolutely tremendous launchpad for us. And at the Heroes of St Valery, that wonderful pipe march was composed by one of the 51st when he was in a prisoner of war camp. So that piece of music was made available via the Poppy Scotland websites. We encouraged pipers across the globe to engage with us. We expected to have a few dozen pipers in different locations who would all play at war memorials, perhaps across Scotland, associated with the Highland Division. But before we knew it, we had over 500 pipers across the globe signing up to play this piece of music at the same time on the anniversary of the events at St Valery. And amongst those contributions, HRH Prince Charles took the salute at Burke Hall, with Pipe Major Leng playing. We had the Queen's own piper playing at the ramparts at Windsor Castle. We had Gavin Moffat, the piper to the Sultan of Brunei. We had pipers on the cliffs above St Valery. We had pipers on offshore oil rigs. We had pipers aboard boats. We even had contact with a piper in space who sadly didn't have his bagpipes with him, but we're hoping in a future year he will play from the space station. So before we knew it, this event was starting to spiral. And across the globe, people who had never heard of the story of St Valery were now, by the pipe music, being hooked into the story to find out more about the 51st and to find out about how events moved from 1940 to the return to St Valery at the end of the war. On the evening of events last year, we had a historians panel very similar to this. We had the playwright, Stuart Buchanan, we had the historian, Cyril David, John Lowe himself, and Brigadier Grant joined us for a discussion on the battle. And again, we're here tonight for a further discussion. Before I go into the second part of my presentation, I really want to pay tribute to one historian who joined us remotely last year with a video that she sent in advance. I had the pleasure of reviewing her book for the Wavell Room British Military Thought website. And that historian is June Goodfield. And June Goodfield's work on St Valery, and particularly on troops who managed to escape and to get away from the events, has helped to reassert the balance of events at St Valery. It helps to give us a more nuanced view of what happened in those dark days. It's a very accessible entry point, and sadly, it's now gone out of print. It's become so popular that it's now out of print, and we're encouraging her now to go and get another print run of it. Since we've reviewed the book, there are more and more who are interested in it. Some of tonight's debate and today's debate may seem like academic history, but as I've said before, the application of detailed scrutiny, well-marshalled evidence, and robust defensive positions are all skills which transfer very neatly into the thinking and actions that leaders aspire to. So clarity of thought is important in history as it is for leaders. St. Valery remains a fiercely contested area on social media, and I know that Adam will touch on that later on, but it shows there is great interest and there's great passion around about this particular area in our history. Goodfield gives us a useful plank to better understand one aspect of the battle and to help to reassert truth of the events in 1840, away from some of the more counterfactual claims that tend to run against historic accounts of the events. What we see is as a continued debate as to whether history is something to record accurately the past, or whether history is used to try and morph views and opinions of the present. And with only a handful of St. Valery veterans left, sadly we lost some of those veterans this year. It's left to us to continue to tell the story, but to tell it accurately and to tell it truly. So what I want to do is just touch very briefly on the myths and try and reassert the balance before I pass to the two guests tonight. The first myth we want to lance early on is that it was Scots only at St. Valery. Whilst the Highland Division was primarily Jock in its makeup, it reflected the whole of the United Kingdom. Kilted men, albeit they weren't wearing kilts for operational reasons, came from the Seaforth, Queen's Own Camerons, the Black Watch, the Gordons, the Argyll and Southern Highlanders. They also fought alongside the Lothian Borders Horse, the Royal Scots Fusiliers, but also the Norfolks, the Northumbrians, Princess Louise's Kensington Regiment, the Middlesex Regiment, and also men from Surrey, Shropshire, Yorkshire, and gunners from Kent and Flintshire. Scottish, English, Welsh soldiers, all side by side in the British Army under overall French command. So that's the first myth that we need to slay as we enter into discussions of the events tonight. The second is that the Highland Division was placed under French command as part of a sacrifice attempt. That's been a myth that's been portrayed, and that Churchill sacrificed the men of the 51st. The facts surrounding this need to be considered fully before making judgments. French called out for support and stability throughout that period. Churchill tried to keep his allies afloat. Belgium, the Netherlands, and most of France had fallen, something that Adam will touch on again later. And something was needed to shore up what was left. The sheer advance and the sheer pace of advance of the strength of the Panzer forces means it would have been impossible for any division to have held in the circumstances. The myth of the men being forgotten is helpfully readjusted by June Goodfield's book, because June Goodfield shows that sailors from Eastbourne and Newhaven did rescue men of the Highland Division, and indeed some French soldiers. So it's important to remember that some did escape. There are other troops left in France, not just the 51st, and furthermore, that there was other attempts to rescue men from the small harbour at St. Valery itself. Mass evacuations on the scale of Dunkirk would have been impossible due to the size of the harbour. Fog during the night prevented the ships from signalling. Remember that very few of the ships at that time would have had radios, and also the fact there was German artillery shelling from above the cliffs. All of that helps to reassert some of the myths of St. Valery. As I say later, Adam, by placing the events of June 1940 into a wider global perspective, will help to bring further balance to our thinking. The image of fortune surrendering to Rommel is a painful one to see. Rommel himself spoke regularly to his family about Fortune. There was clearly a respect there. He sympathetically noted that there was a gallant leadership there. It was good decisions he made at different points, but really he just ran out of luck. It was luck more than anything else as far as Rommel was concerned. From a leadership perspective, many will consider the shame of losing. And during that time, Victor Fortune's honour was still strong. He was invited to lunch by the victorious young Rommel, and he refused to lunch with Rommel. After the war, he was knighted in recognition for his work in supporting prisoners of war. And later on, we hear, after the surrender, de Gaulle talking about the importance of the valiant 51st in his decision to continue fighting and the role models that were set by the 51st at St. Valery. Alternative perspectives are always fought, and people try to find a very one-dimensional view of history. But there's much we can look at in terms of the challenges of losing, but the honour that was shown by Fortune. And Royal Military Academy Centre's Manual for Leadership cites leadership for American Army leaders on the situation of 1940. What it says is that the sacrifices that saved Britain, regimental pride, and the complete truth about esprit de corps all feature in those events. So those aspects need to be held on to as we go forward. Whereas Goodfield is added much to our knowledge, there's still much for us to find out and much for us to look at. Adam and I have been talking already about the panel session next year, because we've just come across some new information about the air battle surrounding St. Valery and events there that we can bring to the table. We've talked about naval aspects which are not well talked about, and Brigadier Grant and I have spoken as well about further work into Rommel, because we always think about it from the British perspective. How can we look at it in future years from the German perspective? So a brief overview of how we got to these commemorations being so significant, but also how there's an ongoing battle for the truth round about St. Valery, and we've tried to resurrect some of the knowledge, some of the evidence to help to give counterbalance to that. At that point, I'm going to stop with that brief introduction, and I'm going to ask Adam to very kindly send it into a more global context in 1940 itself. Adam.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you, Neil. Thanks for inviting me along this evening. I'm delighted to be here to chat to you about the 51st. What I'm going to talk to you about is the bigger picture, and I'm going to try and be as brief as possible, because what I want us to be able to do is have a little bit of a chat about all the three talks after our presentations. And before I start on the bigger picture, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this booklet here. And it is a booklet from 1990. Some of you may recognise it. I think some of you are a bit younger than me, and probably not. But 1990 was when I first became aware of the 51st and St. Valery. In the north of Scotland, the 50th anniversary was well remembered. Neil mentioned it a few minutes ago. There was Grampian TV coverage, P&J articles, the memorial window, that's when it was unveiled, and the crucial difference, of course, 31 years between 1990 and 2021 is, of course, the veterans returned to St. Valery. So I'm not here because of a passing interest. I'm here because of a deep and abiding interest in the 51st and the events of St. Valery. But what I've realised recently, since reading more widely about the Battle of France in June 1940, is a lot more to it than what is in this simple booklet. And don't get me wrong, what's in this booklet, what it packs into just a dozen pages about 1940 is as clear and honest a summary as I'll get about the event in Upper Normandy in June 1940. For example, it mentions specific French units, not just the French, and it mentions the lines of communication troops such as the Border Regiment and the Sherwood Foresters, who didn't get the order to retreat from the River Braille and surrendered the day after the 51st did at St. Valery. They're in this booklet too. So there's a lot of fact in this booklet, no myths. This is what Neil was talking about. Back in 1990, we talked about the facts of St. Valery. We didn't talk about the myths. And I think some of the clarity found in here has been obscured for the sake of media clickbait. of which in turn has fueled the myths which we were just discussing a few minutes ago. So all too often in Scotland, I think we like to focus on the local interest, like the apocryphal tale from the Present Journal about the sinking of the Titanic, Aberdeen man lost at sea. or we talk about the Jacobite Rebellion as a standalone event without putting it into any context as a minor campaign of the War of Austrian Succession. It's the same as the 51st in 1940. If we put our blinkers on, it's quite possible to focus on just the 51st versus Rommel. But it's actually so much more than that. We need to consider not just what happened to the 51st after Dunkirk, but put it into the context of the aims of a British government whose strategy was to focus on a global war in June 1940. So that means not just looking at tactical events happening between the Somme and the Seine, and I'm sure you know that story, and if you don't, Brigadier Grant's going to do that in his session that comes after this, but we need to look at the battle's place in a world war. And that was a long world war, a long air-sea war, as St Andrews professor Phillips K. O'Brien would call it. That's the sort of global war Britain had always fought when fighting continental powers. For example, the War of Austrian Succession, which I've already mentioned, the 7 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, and the First World War. The strategy, as always, was a long war of attrition, with Britain's war effort focused on blockades using the power of the Royal Navy. And right now, I know you're all thinking, why on earth is he talking about the Royal Navy at an army event? What is that all about? It's because the fate of the 51st has to be put into context in the bigger picture. And that was the fate of the 51st. It wasn't the sacrifice, as Neil's mentioned. It was the fate. The 51st Highland Division had to be in Upper Normandy in June 1940. It had to be kept in the war. And let's not forget, at this point, the 51st was the largest Allied division in Europe and in an absolutely key role to play in the Battle of France. The 51st was large, it was motorised. It was until its final encirclement well supplied to Rouen with ammunition, fuel, reinforcements. 850 men reinforced the division on 8th June, the day before it was cut off. It was resupplied from large depots at Rouen. And unlike many of the French divisions that fought alongside, it had a long and distinguished pedigree, and its most senior officer had been in charge since 1937. So I mentioned the bigger picture a couple of times, but what does the bigger picture look like in June 1940? Norway was about to fall. So what? What does that matter? It matters because the Kriegsmarine now have U-boat bases in the fjords at the entrance to the North Atlantic. They are not bottled up in the North Sea as they were in the First World War. The U-boats now have easy access to the convoy killing grounds, which very nearly put us out of the war in 1917. That matters. It matters at an operational level because materiel is coming in and out of the UK through the North Atlantic. That is now at greater risk. Losing Norway to the Nazis really matters to Whitehall. And it matters for the 51st in France. Why? Because at the same time as Norway was falling, Whitehall was getting signals that Italy was about to enter the war, to kick a man when he was down. And if Italy entered the war, Malta's at risk, Alexandria's at risk, Suez Canal's at risk, India's at risk. That's the bigger picture. Norway and Italy, as well as France, home and empire threatened. That's a strategic view facing London in June 1940. When people write about the 51st, they often say it was sacrificed to keep France in the war, but there's never an explanation about why France needed to be kept in the war. It's almost like after Dunkirk, we should have written France off and got the 51st home. Was keeping them there pointless? Is that what people mean when they say the 51st Highland Division was sacrificed? I don't like that word sacrificed. It seems to be in vogue for military historians to proclaim that the 51st was sacrificed. I don't like the implication that the 51st was carelessly treated and that a British infantry division would be written off simply for a point of principle, for a point of honour. What does that say about the 51st? And that stance doesn't reflect the contemporary discussions recorded in the minutes of the British War Cabinet in June 1940, nor the response of the Royal Navy when the 51st was cut off from Rouen. In June 1940, France needed to stay in the war. The French fleet was needed in the Mediterranean because the Royal Navy was needed to bottle up the U-boats in Norway, and that was a large coast. The French army needed to stay in the war because the British had a small army. In the 1930s, the cabinet decided that Britain would have a large navy and a large strategic air force, because the French will complement us with a large army and a large tactical air force. In the 1930s, the idea that the Nazis could knock the French out of the war, it was unthinkable. It was unthinkable in London, it was unthinkable in Paris, but there we were in 1940, and that was now a real possibility. But we'd still fight on as a team. We'll fight the Nazis, and if we have to, the fascist Italians, the Axis, together the Axis. So the 51st wasn't left behind because we couldn't have another British formation running to the sea. It wasn't deliberately sacrificed just to get France in the war. The largest Allied division in France in June 1940, the 51st was a key component in the Allies' long war against the fascist Axis. So, after Dunkirk, the bulk of the BEF was back in England, but 100,000 soldiers and RAF were still in France, and thousands more British troops were being landed at Cherbourg and Saint-Malo every day. The BEF's logistic tail from Brest, Saint-Nazaire, Saint-Malo, Caen, Le Havre and Cherbourg, running through Rennes, Le Mans and Rouen, was still intact. That logistic tail was there as a foundation for a second BEF. Operationally, Britain was getting into its stride. Our factories had been ramping up war production in the late 1930s, and there was a flood of materiel orders being fulfilled in the USA. We were in it for the long haul, and in early June 1940, we were still back in France. We were landing troops in Normandy in 1940, and those troops being landed after Dunkirk included the 52nd Lowland Division, Scotland's other territorial division. More Scottish territorials were landed in France after Dunkirk. Why? The role was to be the same as the 51st, continue the fight against the Nazis on the continent. The evacuation at Dunkirk was the end of the Battle of Flanders. The Battle of France was still looming. That's the difference between Fall Gelb and Fall Rot, Case Yellow, Case Red, and why I'm always keen to differentiate the campaign which ended at Dunkirk with the next one which included different formations, including the 51st. It's a lazy shorthand to lump everything that happened in France in 1940 as it did Dunkirk. So let's take a couple of minutes to think about what happened in France in 1940. As I see it, there were three phases. Phase one was the Battle of Flanders, the disastrous first 2 weeks when the Allies were pushed back to the Dunkirk pocket. It was completely disastrous. There's absolutely no other way to look at it. Most of the best formations within the BEF and the French army were surrounded and defeated. And I believe Brigadier Grant's going to cover some of that in his talk in a few minutes. Phase two was a miracle of Dunkirk. I think it's no exaggeration to call it a miracle. It was a miracle and a triumph for the British Armed Forces to get over 300,000 men away from under the guns of the Nazis. The very short campaign before it was a disaster. The evacuation operation was a triumph. So that was the end of the Battle of Flanders, phase two. Phase three is the Battle of France. This is where the 51st really comes into the story. In Britain, this phase is almost always ignored, and it just lasted 3 more weeks, but you put yourself back into early June 1940, just after Dunkirk. You put yourself into the cabinet war rooms, you're still looking at a long war, and you're still looking at the French fighting on. Thinking further back, typical, I never check my notes. Sorry about this. Yeah, sorry. I got my notes mixed up there, very sorry about that. Hopefully this will be edited out for Poppy Scotland. Thinking back to August 1914, when you put yourself into 1940, France lost hundreds of thousands of men and a large chunk of land. It fought on. Churchill was in the cabinet then too. He was First Lord of the Admiralty in 1914. Did the British give up in France after Antwerp and Mons? No. Churchill was at the top table in 1914, and in 1940 he was thinking back. He was a historian. He's thinking about 1914, but he's also thinking about 1810 and Wellington's line of Torres. The bulk of Portugal had been lost to Napoleon's armies, but Lisbon was saved. A long march back to the borders of France began. And I believe Brigadier Grant is the man to speak to about that campaign, but that's another story. So why couldn't the French create an equivalent of the line of Torres around Brittany? A short defensive line where the best channel in the Atlantic ports are in Allied hands and the Royal Navy supplies them. The French Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, and a junior defence minister called Charles de Gaulle actually thought about a Brittany redoubt. They discussed it with the British cabinet in June 1940. They thought about fighting on from French North Africa too, evacuating 500,000 French troops from the south of France to Tunisia and Algeria was an idea. It never happened, but they were serious about continuing to fight. So hindsight is a wonderful thing, but please put yourself back into the summer of 1940. The decision-making process is not so clear-cut, and in early June, the French had not given up. They were still talking about fighting on. They did have a wobble in mid-May when they thought Paris was exposed, and after St. Valery, it was a complete collapse. But at the start of June, before Marshal Pétain poisoned the cabinet with his defeat, the Prime Minister of France was still bullish. And in the speech given by Winston Churchill, which I know you will all know, there was a clear statement of intent to fight on in France. This is his speech where he told the nation, "We shall fight in the beaches, we shall fight in the landing grounds." So you all know that speech. I'm not going to do the voice. But we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender. That's the bit we all know. It's a very famous speech. But if you read the rest of his speech, you read the sentence just before it, one sentence before it starts, "We shall go on to the end, we shall fight in France." Before fighting on the beaches, before fighting in the streets, we shall fight in France. That's the Prime Minister making it crystal clear on 4th June, the same day as Dunkirk falls, that we'll continue to support France and continue the fight in France. And that's what the 51st was doing on the day Dunkirk surrendered. That's what the 51st was doing on the day Churchill said, "We shall fight in France." The 51st was fighting in France. There's your fighting 51st. On that 4th June, as 51st tried to dislodge the Abbeville bridgehead, the signs weren't great. Cooperation between French and British divisions was poor, and frankly, communication between French and other French divisions was poor. But France hadn't given up. And I don't think I can stress the following statement enough. We, as allies, were fighting the Nazis. It wasn't just the Germans, it was the Nazis, the evil Nazis. That's who we were up against. And to use Churchill's words again from that same 4th June speech, "Even though large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen, or may fall into the grip of the Gestapo and all the odious apparatus of Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail." With Churchill in command, we were not giving up the fight against the Gestapo and the odious apparatus of Nazi rule. And we were determined to keep fighting alongside the French, and that meant doing our bit with everything the British still had in France. That meant the 51st, along with many other units that were currently in the Maginot Line, moved north to form the very long Weygand Line along the Somme. That river, so infamous to Britons during the First World War, would now be the front line again to decide France's fate in the Second. The Germans were there on the Somme in 1916, and they were on the Somme in 1918, and they were beaten back both times. So in June 1940, you had to believe it could happen again. Going back to April 1940, no one could possibly imagine that the French collapse would have been so thorough and so fast. So when the 51st was attached to the French army and moved from in front of the Maginot Line, it moved in front of the Maginot Line, it was only going to be temporary and they would soon rejoin the BEF. However, in June 1940, circumstances meant that the 51st was still under French command, as was the British 1st Armoured Division, or should I say what was left of the 1st Armoured Division after it lost its infantry brigade and the tank regiment in Calais. It was the expanded Calais garrison, which was sacrificed and abandoned to protect Dunkirk. Back to June 1940, and the British 1st Armoured Division was under French command and in action supporting French divisions. The RAF's Advanced Air Striking Force, the AASF, the RAF squadrons based in France, supported the French as well as supporting the British formation still fighting in France. RAF fighter squadrons based in England, flying hundreds of sorties over the Channel, some squadrons flying twice a day to support the troops in France. And this is the research that Neil mentioned earlier, that a resident of St. Valery has done. He's researched these RAF sorties quickly, that the RAF air cover over St. Valery was comparable to the air cover supporting the Dunkirk evacuations. At the same time as this, the French mountain troops that had been sent to Norway returned to France via Scotland to create a new division, the 40th Division, which fought alongside the 51st at St. Valery. And French troops from Dunkirk were being sent back to the front line via Cherbourg in the newly formed 17th Division. Troops lifted from the beaches of Dunkirk and immediately put back into the front line in completely new division. That was desperate measures, but France was short of troops and the Weygand Line was stretched thinly. Every single man in khaki counted in France in June 1940. So as well as the 51st, the 1st Armoured and RAF in France and returning French formations, who else was there? It was only one small unit, but one company of the 1st King's Shropshire Light Infantry, which had been cut off from the rest of its battalion by the German advance in mid-May, ended up guarding the airfield at Dieppe and then ended up at Belle-Rose in the St. Valery pocket. Why had they not been shipped back to England when the survivors of the rest of the battalion had been lifted from Dunkirk? It was because they were still in France and still needed in France to continue fighting the war. You can see a parallel between that small company and the rest of its battalion and the 51st and the BEF. Dunkirk had been the end of the Battle of Flanders. The Battle of France was still to come. And who else was in France? The BEF reinforcement depots at Rouen were cleared. The men formed into provisional infantry battalions and anti-tank companies, and they were sent to the front line south of Rouen. This was the reinforcement depot I mentioned earlier. On 8th June, it sent 850 men to replenish the 51st. At the same time, it was forming ad hoc battalions to guard and then destroy the bridges over the Seine to support the French. British lines of communication troops were formed into frontline formation called Bowman Division, and it also supported the French. Part of Bowman Division attacked the 51st after 152 Brigade had been hammered on 4th and 5th of June. And this is where A Brigade come into the 51st story. That's why the men of the Border Regiment and the Sherwood Foresters I mentioned at the start of the talk ended up being surrounded on the River Braille. They didn't surrender until the day after St Valery, on the 13th of June. On that same day, 13th of June, the rest of A Brigade, which had been part of Barrack Force, was lifted from Le Havre. Operation Cycle, or rescued them, and a fairly substantial part of the 51st too. The men from the 51st, the Black Watch and the Argylls were shipped back to England. But where did the others lifted at Le Havre end up? They ended up in Cherbourg. The day after St Valery, British troops were being redeployed in France to continue fight in France. The aforementioned 52nd Lowland Division, as well as the 1st Canadian Division, were also being landed in France after St Valery fell. And another British division, 43rd, was waiting to cross the Channel. This was the core of a 2nd BEF to fight on. I mentioned it earlier, we had the infrastructure in place to support it, and that was the commitment to fight on in France. It was all hands to the pumps in Paris and London to keep the fight going against the Nazis. That's what you've got to remember. That's the reason why the 51st was still in France after Dunkirk and not in the first troop ship home from Cherbourg. So to conclude, in June 1940, the 51st was not abandoned. The 51st Division was not betrayed. The 51st Division was definitely not alone, and the 51st Division was certainly not sacrificed. It was none of those things. The 51st did everything it could in the circumstances. Its rescue was thwarted by fog, bold Nazis and French intransigence. The 51st Highland Division had tactically done its bit, gallantly supporting its allies in the hour of need against the odious, evil Nazis and playing its rightful part in a long, strategic global war. Thank you. Back to you.
Adam, thank you very, very much. Adam, we normally see on Twitter with clarity, conciseness, and precision in reasserting the truth in 160 characters, but a joy to hear him in full flow there tonight. That's a tour de force on setting the context in an international scene. Adam, thank you very, very much for setting us in context. We're now going to go right into the heart of St Valery, into the fight around about the harbour town, and particularly through leadership perspectives and leadership considerations. Brigadier Grant, we'll pass the floor to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I will now wrestle with the technology, hopefully successfully. And you should soon see a slide.
Perfect.
You got the slide?
Yes, sir.
Good. I mean, the good news for me, well, sorry, the bad news for me is I can't see you. The bad news for you is you can still see me. Apparently, this is one of the quirks of the system. Could I just say, first of all, how admirably Adam has explained a part of the St Valery story that is so seldom told. About the fact that a new BEF has been stood up, a corps command had been organised. 5-2 Division was actually landing in Cherbourg the day after the Division 51st was surrendering. These are the facts that I'm so glad you put over, because for many people they're lost and the world stops on the date on the 12th of June. Right. I hope I can get through something in about 20 minutes, which will give you a flavour about St Valery and leadership. One or two of you may know more about this. Some of you, hopefully, in the brigade and in the army, may have even walked the ground with me. I've been fortunate enough to walk and drive the road to St Valery, I think 6 or 7 times now, and been on several of the commemorative events. However, I do need to set the scene in a much wider context for those of you that are not aware of the big picture. So by way of introduction, in 1938, with war looming, the decision was taken across the nation to double the strength of the TA, the Territorial Army. It was hugely successful. Battalions went out and recruited throughout the whole of the United Kingdom. In Scotland, the TA companies were doubled. There's some wonderful books and stories that tell how all this was done. So within a short space of time, perhaps 3, 4, 5 months, the size of the Territorial Army had doubled. The result of this was that it was able to have not one but 2 divisions. The 51st Highland Division and the 9th Scottish Division both formed in September 1939. It would later be the 9th Scottish Division that would take on the mantle of the 51st and go to North Africa after the surrender of the 51st Highland Division. The division moved to Aldershot as soon as it was formed, and in 1940, in January, it departed for Le Havre. Now, the military people among you will immediately think 3 months to work up and bring together into a cohesive formation with a number of cohesive bits, battalions, companies, and so on, is a huge undertaking. And this, I think, is almost the first leadership point I want to make, and the first command point that I have to make, is that there's an amazing undertaking to actually turn the 51st Highland Division literally from birth to deployment in such a short space of time. The man overall responsible for this was Major General Victor Fortune. Fortune was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Black Watch in 1903. He served in the First World War. He commanded the 1st Battalion of the Black Watch from 1916, and at the end of the war was commanding the 46th Brigade. I'll turn to Fortune later, right at the end of my talk, although some comments have already been made about him. We've also had some comments about what the Army would call the order of battle, the division. It's a territorial division. At this point, they are all reservists or TA soldiers. There are 9 battalions, as you've heard, drawn from Cameron's, Seaforth, Gordon's, Black Watch and Argyll's. Each battalion about 1,000 strong, so that only means 9,000. So how come they were 20,000 strong? Well, the answer is that they had all the additional elements, the artillery, the engineers, the medics, the communicators, the logisticians, this huge body of men which is brought together to form a division which effectively becomes a fighting force with the ability to, for a certain amount of time, to stand alone. The point has already been made about the breadth of division in terms of where it's recruited from. And indeed, it's absolutely right. There were elements like the Kensington Rifles from London, but the vast majority came from the Highlands, and a trip through any Highland village today would almost undoubtedly show you a memorial with a number of names from the 51st Highland Division on it. Initially, it went to Le Havre, and it deployed, as you've heard, into the Maginot Line. It was put under command of the French, in fact, 21st French Division. Now, an interesting point for those of you who serve and are reservists, a decision was made to strengthen, not my words, the territorial divisions with putting in regular battalions in place of some of the territorial ones. The end result, the division that we're going to talk about, ends up with 6 territorial or reservist battalions and 3 regulars, the 1st Gordons, the 1st Black Watch, and the 2nd Seaforth. That is an interesting discussion point in itself. I have to say that I have, in all my reading and talking to veterans, never come away with a view that the territorial battalion soldiers fought any less well than their regular counterparts. We may talk about the higher command of leadership later on, but in terms of soldiers, they were equal to their regular counterparts. So, why do we end up where we are? with the 51st Line Division. This map shows France on the left, Germany on the right in blue, white is Belgium in the lowlands, you can see the English Channel, and you can see a Highland Division emblem situated right down there where the Maginot Line is, which of course was to be a line through which Hitler would be unable to break through. The German plan was the sickle cut, because as you can see from this pale blue-grey arrow, it is a huge left hook that cuts off and encompasses all those units along the French border and the British Expeditionary Force that is also in Belgium and will subsequently end up at Dunkirk. So this is why the 51st Line Division do not end up in Dunkirk. This is, in black lines, the plan of the sickle cut with all the various German armoured groups. You can see Army Group A, B, and so on. And you can see that the 51st Line Division in very late May is moved all the way from the Maginot Line up to Abbeville on the Somme. Again, I emphasize, outside at that point, the German sickle cut. It was in fact going to reinforce the French line on the Somme. It ends up being really thinly stretched. It sounds like a lot of men that I've described, but they're covering a front of 23 miles to the coast and with no mobile reserve. This map shows where they were, and you can see up on the right the line of the Somme and Abbeville, and you can see a blue horseshoe around Saint-Valery-en-Caux, where they will end up. These are the timelines that show what happened to the division. It arrives on the 28th of May behind the Somme. It moves forward, and on the 4th of May, it takes part in the French attacks on Abbeville, which are designed to drive the Germans back over the Somme. They've at that point established a firm bridgehead. The attacks are not a great success. I'll only look at very briefly, two of the battalions of the 51st Line Division. The 4th Seaforth and the 4th Camerons take part in this attempt to dislodge the French bridgehead. Both are beaten back with horrendous casualties. Why? Poor intelligence. They arrive the night before and they're told to attack positions that ought to be weaker than them, and they actually turn out to be stronger. We're so used today with our iPhones and iPads and so on, instant communication. Communication in the field army in 1940 was very few radios or wirelesses, and most of it done by using lines, telephone lines, which as soon as they were broken, communication failed. This was the field telephone. So, for example, an attack by the 4th Camerons, which was supposed to be 2 company attacks coordinated, when one lost communication with the other, the first attack failed, the second one should have stopped, but it didn't. It also means that the tactical command, the battalion headquarters, the commanding officer, didn't have the ability to go forward with his men, because if he did, he lost contact with his higher formation, his gunners and everybody else. So there are huge lessons to be learned in these failed attacks. But the one lesson that I think is particularly pertinent for the military, and if I may quote, 152 Brigade, which was part of these attacks, the casualties in 152 Brigade on the 4th of June were crippling. 20 officers and 543 other ranks. The major proportion being borne by the 4th Seaforth and 4th Camerons. Remember, these are battalions that started about 900 strong each. In effect, these 2 battalions were down to 50% of their fighting strength. Now, that, of course, just those casualties alone requires a whole lot of reorganization. You can't have half-strength companies, So you have to merge companies and amalgamate them. But the real point is that when you look across the board, everybody, almost everybody, is going to be stepping up in their job. If you were a platoon commander, your company commander might be dead and you would be the company commander tomorrow. If you were a sergeant, you might be the sergeant major. If you were a private, you might well be a corporal or a lance corporal. So training in any army needs to look at building the ability for people to move up at a very short notice up into the next level of command and perhaps 2 up. Right. The attack has failed. This is the 4th. You can see the timelines there. I'm now going to turn to the 5th of June, and we are now in defense. We've fallen back and we're forming, 51st are forming a defensive line. And I'm going to look, first of all, at the 7th Argylls. You can see Abbeville, you can see in a blue circle the 4th of June where the previous attacks came. And now you can see in what we call in the army goose eggs, different company locations and a battalion headquarters location shown on these maps. This is one battalion. To make it a little easier, this is what they look like on the modern map today. HQ is a battalion headquarters. A, B, C, and D are companies. And any military man will tell you that the way you deploy is to have mutual support. So one company can support the other, they can see the other, and you have defense all around, a coherent group. This was just not possible. And the reason it's not possible was that they were told they had to defend such a huge frontage. If they had been one single battalion group, all around where C is, they would have just been bypassed anyway. The reality was that, of course, as the Germans swept forward, they were bypassed. Isolated platoons ended up fighting. There were heroic actions all over these companies, and I could spend and have spent a day on the ground bringing up some wonderful leadership stories. Let me just mention one though. The battalion headquarters in that HQ is commanded by Copper Buchanan, an Argyll and Southern Highlander Lieutenant Colonel. And throughout the day, he shows exceptional leadership. In fact, more than a day, a night and a day. And although he has lost contact with many of his companies, he continues to command. The Germans are pressing in all around the village of Frans-Leur. Two great examples of leadership, personal leadership, are Regimental Sergeant Major Lockie and Company Sergeant Major Dyer. They gather together a small group of people, and they both to be headquarter people, and they would go out into the extremities of the village and literally take on and drive out the Germans as they were infiltrating. They did this all day to the point of exhaustion. As I said, there were numerous acts, wonderful acts of bravery. One disaster was in the headquarters. For some reason, the medical support had disappeared. It had been falsely withdrawn or whatever. The end result that is in the headquarters, which was in this building here, this school building, they had to cope with all the casualties, all in the cellars. You can't actually see the cellars underneath, but this is the battalion headquarters. And when eventually Buchanan gave the order, every man for himself, and there were a whole range of different escapes that were planned, and some were successful, some not. It was, as ever, the Padre who stayed behind, and that is an example of courage and command as well. If I may quote, the 5th of June was described in the 7th Argyll's War Diary as the blackest day in the history of the battalion. Although the great traditions have been upheld, much glory was added to battalion history. On this day alone, 23 officers and 500 other ranks were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. From this point onwards, the 7th Argyll's ceased to exist as a separate formation in the 51st Highland Division. I think I'm building up a picture of a running battle. This isn't just a pocket around St. Valery and a battle. This is a division that's now involved in a fighting withdrawal and losing huge numbers of men as it is literally overwhelmed by vast mobile German forces. Just to the north of the Argylls, 7th Argylls, were the 8th Argylls. If again I may quote, by the morning of the 6th of June, Lieutenant Colonel Hamish Grant, no relation, was trying to digest the unpalatable news that his battalion, to all intents and purposes, had ceased to exist. C&D companies he thought were holding out somewhere, but he'd lost contact and the Germans had passed them by. He had not heard from A and B companies since the previous morning. As far as he was concerned, the battalion was now effectively headquarter company made up of the anti-aircraft platoon, 3-inch mortar platoon, 3 remaining carriers, a motley collection of signallers, clerks, pioneers and orderlies, a grand total of 140. Take that back to the 900,000 it would have started with. Enter Lorne Campbell. Commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Argyll and Southern Highlanders, a TA officer, in 1921, and now the battalion's second in command. For many men in the battalion, he, rather than Hamish Grant, should have been commanding during the war. Although a territorial, he was a rare breed of natural soldier, with a power of leadership only enhanced by his imposing 6'3" frame. During the 6th of June, he gathered together A and B companies, A first, then moved off with them. He found B company. He then found a platoon of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. He found 15 French Marines hiding in a lighthouse. And delaying up by day and moving by night, he moved over 200 men back through the German lines because the Germans had swept on. And so he had to get back through the German lines to get back to the 51st Highland Division, which he did in the early hours of the 8th of June. And I read again, Major Lorne Campbell had accomplished the most remarkable feat of the campaign. He had led men long since given up for lost on a march of 14 miles behind enemy lines, moving only at night and relying solely on his compass ability. No less than 7 changes of direction were necessary. A mistake and they would have been fatal. They bumped into Germans all over the place. Only 3 men were lost, almost certainly falling asleep and being left behind. He was awarded the DSO, the Distinguished Service Order, and he would later go on to win the VC in North Africa. A few quick points. Commanding in the withdrawal. Command is always challenging. Commanding in the withdrawal is particularly challenging. Soldiers need to know why they're going backwards. They don't like retreating. You look at the retreat from Mons in 1914, or retreat to Corunna with Sir John Moore, and find that because they didn't know what was going on, they become disheartened and demoralized. The pace of the withdrawal, the move back, eventually to St. Valery, was dictated by the French. Fortune and 51st had to conform to the French falling back as well. Fortune had a lot of wheeled vehicles. The French army at this stage and those in this area were almost all horse-drawn. So the pace of withdrawal was desperately slow. And there was a complete lack of information coming down to the 51st Highland Division. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Let me now move on. Fortune by now has realized that things are not going well. He is supposed to get across the Seine and on back, as you've heard, to Cherbourg. But going to see the French command one day, he actually sees the French blowing up the bridges that he is supposed to get across. He arrives in the French headquarters, I'm sad to say, to find the French commander has effectively broken down and more or less demurs to anything that Fortune says. Fortune realizes that the chances of now getting back across the Seine are getting very remote. He makes the decision to go for Le Havre, and over the 9th, 10th of June, he produces a force which is known as Arc Force. So he puts together this force, which is 154 Brigade, essentially, with a lot of the badly damaged units like the 7th and 8th Argylls, and he sends them back to Le Havre. And that is why a significant proportion of the 51st Highland Division do actually escape the net at St. Valery. He gets out in the nick of time, and literally minutes later, his retreating force would have been cut off. Now, this looks a bit technical. I will be very brief, but it is a model used both by the military and business, and it's called the Boyd cycle or OODA loop. And basically, if a business is coming in, looks, or a commander looks at things, he observes, orientates, makes a decision, and acts on that decision. The problem here is that the Germans were inside the French decision cycle. The French were not observing, orientating, deciding fast enough. To quote Little Hart, the pace of panzer warfare paralyzed the French staff. The orders they issued might have been effective, but for being repeatedly 24 hours late for the situation they were intended to meet. And this is why the French had not realized that the Germans were now right round behind them as well and pressing up the Seine to start capturing the bridges. That is the Arc Force getting away, and they get to Le Havre and they get away. And that was, as I've said, around the 8th, 9th of June. So now we are moving towards what is going on at St. Valery. I'll let you read that for yourselves. Now, for the non-military, in very simple terms, this represents outnumbering, the 51st Highland being outnumbered, probably 10 to 1. These are panzer divisions, armored divisions, rapidly moving divisions. There are masses and masses of them, and they have swept all the way round. And you can see on this diagram the furthest left hook, which is actually coming round the back of St. Valery at this stage, and this is Rommel. I want to look very briefly at two examples, great examples of leadership. The first is the 2nd Seaforth, and you can see the 2nd Seaforth up at the top and Saint-Sylvain. And here we come to one of these really difficult things that it's always painful to talk about. But war is brutal, and not all commanders can sustain themselves. Already one commanding officer had been relieved in command through what we might nicely term fatigue. We now find that Major Grant, in fact, Hugh Grant's grandfather, is actually de facto commanding the 2nd Seaforth because the commander, I'm afraid, has lost the will to fight. There is an amazing series of engagements here, which are all extremely well described in a number of books. The 2nd Seaforth, which split between these two villages, are manning the left flank of these positions around St. Valery. To their horror and amazement, and this explains how fast Rommel has moved, from the west, the Latotte company says that it can see 40 tanks approaching. That's A and B company see 40 tanks approaching. Almost simultaneously, B and C companies, where Major Grant is, can see another 60 tanks approaching. This poor battalion, which would have a few really inadequate anti-tank guns, has none because the Germans were expected to come from the other side, and so the anti-tank guns have been sent across to the other side of the St. Valery pocket. The stories here are amazing. Major Grant eventually tries to get men out, but the Germans have gone right through, the tanks have gone right through, and you heard earlier, they're sitting on top of St. Valery, actually able to shell through. The levels of leadership within this and the stories of individual leadership are quite exceptional. Let me just pick up one more. This is the Black Watch. They're over the other side at Saint-Pierre-le-Vigueur. During the course of the day, the 10th rather, the commanding officer is called back to brigade for a conference. The two positions that the battalion are formed in are A and B and C and D. He goes away to the headquarters, which is shown in dark blue on the left, and he can't get back to the two companies at A and B. Enter another man, the adjutant, Captain Bill Bradford. He, de facto, is the most senior officer in what was left of the headquarters. And he's the man that has to make the decisions. But there are no orders coming through because his CO has been separated from him. Eventually, he takes charge, and he has been moving about on a captured bicycle, or a liberated bicycle at one stage. He makes a decision on his own back to withdraw further back to St. Valery. Today in the army, we would call it mission command, when you actually make a decision based on what you believe is right and what you believe the higher commander's intention would be. Bill Bradford withdrew successfully those two battalions, two companies rather, got back into the St. Valery pocket, where he continued to fight. He was captured and he escaped on the way from the prisoner of war columns, and the story of his escape is another wonderful illustration of personal valor and courage. I've done my best to illustrate some of the individual leadership and command challenges that take place during the withdrawal. I've not just concentrated on the fight around St. Valery, but given you a flavour, I hope, of what had happened to bring them there. The one person I need, although several have already spoken, I should yet speak about, is General Victor Fortune. While you read this, his last message, let me say that I believe that Victor Fortune was an exceptional commander. He led with firm and clear style to the very end. He had to cope with a lack of direction and eventually to take the lead, not only with his own forces, but commanding significant elements of the French army as well. In captivity, he did all he did or could to improve the prisoners' conditions. In 1944, in a prisoner of war camp, he suffered a stroke but refused to be repatriated. I was asked to talk about leadership and command, and to conclude, for me, Victor Fortune should not be remembered as the man who surrendered the 51st Highland Division, but should be remembered as a wonderful example of one who commanded in adversity. Thank you.
Brigadier Grant, thank you. We are unable to get across to do battlefield studies just now, but that was an absolute outstanding input tonight, and through the leadership lens in particular. Thank you very, very much. Questions are starting to come in there. I'm conscious of time, but please, if you have questions, put them into the text box on the right-hand side, and we'll pick up what we can in the last period here. Maybe we've got 6 or 7 minutes left. Adam, I was going to ask you about French generals and French leaders, because that's something we've talked about. That first question that's come in is about, is it fair to give a negative view of the French army and French commanders at that time? What was the perceptions of the Highland Division of the French?
I don't think the Highland Division, from reading the memoirs, you see, in Saul David's book, you see there's not a very high opinion of the French. And certainly Saul David doesn't give them a fair hearing, I don't think. And perhaps other histories as well treat them as the cheese-eating surrender monkeys of infamy. But I don't think that's fair at all. Going back to the first point Nicky raised about de Gaulle, de Gaulle gave that speech, I think it was in Edinburgh, I can't remember where exactly it was, and he quoted the 51st, and that's brought up quite a lot. He also mentioned the 15th Division from the First World War, and he had been a prisoner of war when the 15th Division won its fame at Beaugency in 1918. So I think that was a bit of spin at Charles de Gaulle. He did meet Fortune, he was involved with him, but on 4th of June, he was in Paris setting himself up as a junior defence minister. So we've got to remember that. So de Gaulle didn't see the 51st in action, but he did meet with Victor Fortune. And then on the 28th of May, I think it was 152 Brigade were up there in support for de Gaulle's 4th Armoured Division attacking. But I think what 51st were probably seeing was a lack of communication. There was a lack of communication. I mentioned that in my little talk. Lack of communication between the 51st, lack of communication with the French divisions. But there was a lack of communication up and down the French chain of command. It was a very unwieldy chain of command. They didn't trust radios. They didn't relied on dispatch riders. So everything that they sent out and got back was, as Charles mentioned, about a day out of date. So that wasn't very good. A lot of these French commanders, though, were new into their position. Take General Eyler. So Brigadier Grant mentioned that he was a broken man, and I have full sympathy with General Eyler of 9th Corps. Up until about a week before, he'd been commander of 31st Division, which one of the French divisions on the Somme in 9th Corps. He was bumped up, given a corps. That corps was put into a new army, 10th Army, that had been created the day before. The general commanding 10th Army was a chap called Robert Altmaier. He had been an old friend of Maxime Weygand. He was brought back from retirement. The man had retired in 1937. A week before he went into battle, he was told, create an army out of nothing. Then General Eyler, his corps was attached to that army, and he was normally a corps in the French army was 2 divisions. He had multiple divisions. He had the 51st, which was really the jewel in the crown. That was the best division he had. And 31st Division, which was an Alpine division, that was his old division, but it's Alpine, it was mountain troops, they were lightly armed. He also had these 3 light cavalry divisions. They'd been badly mauled on the earlier battles in May. And they were a new operating model. Had been cavalry divisions at the start of the war. The French had realised that in the Polish campaign that cavalry divisions were obsolete, so they converted these cavalry divisions into what they called light cavalry, and there were a brigade of 2 regiments of mounted troops on horse, and then they had a regiment of armoured cars and a regiment of light tanks, and nobody knew what to do with them. They got, like I say, absolutely mauled. Their general officers didn't know them, the corps commander didn't know, the army commander, they just did not know what to do with them. They were, I wouldn't say they were worthless, but they were thrown into battle and badly mauled. So when they get to St. Valery, they are completely demoralised. And around where 2nd Seaford was, up at Saint-Salvien, there was French troops there. And in Saul David's book, he talks about them running away. Half of them run away. I think what's missing there is we don't give enough credit to the half of them who stayed behind and fought. They were badly led, badly trained, and they stood and fought. And there's a chap in Picardy who runs a website, and he puts up these little biographies of French soldiers he's found. It's very difficult to find, but basically he's got this list of all these Alpine troops, all these reservists who ended up in St. Valery in these demoralised divisions, and they stood and fought and they died. So the French get a bad press. I think the men of the 51st who came back, quite a few of them, are very disparaging. Look, sometimes there's a chap on Twitter, his dad said he would never hear a bad word said about the French because he got out of Ville-les-Roses, and one of the DLCs, the 2nd DLC, was defending that, and he said the French let me escape. You know, so they were men that were fighting, dying. There's memorials to French all around St. Valery as well. So yeah, I think we've got a very negative view. And the time you were talking about this nuanced view, Neil, but we need to get back about the 51st. I think it's time for the French to get their say in the St. Valery story. And if I may continue, I know I'm hogging it a bit, but you mentioned in your talk about the commemoration of the First World War and the Second World War in France, and certainly there's a lot of trouble this week. Apart from being the anniversary of the Valery, is also the anniversary of the massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane, where the village is completely wiped out. And that's an SS division heading from the south of France to Normandy. The real tragedy of Oradour is they included conscripts from Alsace and Lorraine, which were included in Großdeutschland. In Oradour-sur-Glane was a community of exiles from Alsace and Lorraine. So French SS were killing French people in France. And the Second World War is a really difficult period for the French to deal with for that very reason. So for us to be able to have people in St. Valery being prepared to take on this commemoration when there's a lot of difficulty around, you know, the surrender of a large number of French forces, I think it's great that they were prepared to embrace that and do that daily remembrance, as you see, and certainly the annual remembrance, because in a lot of places, that period, the 1940, is not going to be a period that they're going to remember with a lot of glory.
Thanks, Adam. Absolutely, the partnership with France and Scotland and the UK has been phenomenal. And one of the things has been right about resurrecting multiple perspectives of the battle. Charles, I'll come to you with a last question, if that's okay. We're on the 81st commemoration. The 80th last year was significant internationally. How should we remember St. Valerie going forward? What should be the abiding messages that go out to those who are taking part in commemorations throughout this weekend and going forwards?
Thank you. I just put my hand up to say I just absolutely agree totally, and thought Adam's explanation of the Higher French Command and its weaknesses was quite excellent. And I just wanted to emphasize the point he made, that some of the accounts of some of the French fighting were magnificent. It wasn't that they were all running away or putting up white flags, or that would be an entirely false picture. How should we go forward? Well, you've heard me say before that every village throughout the Highlands and beyond have memorials, but particularly in the Highlands, we ought to do more about knowing where all these people were and what their relationships were. So I think local commemoration in towns and villages, local churches, is extremely important. And perhaps there should be more in the way of local services on or around the anniversary. I absolutely applaud the pipers and all the efforts that went into it last year. And yes, we've got to do it even bigger and even better. And of course, we absolutely have to go to St. Valerie.
You're on mute, Neil.
Absolutely, a roll on, a return to St. Valerie, certainly for the 85th, but hopefully before then. As we come to a close, Adam, can you just take us through the facts in terms of the figures relating to St. Valerie? Just a final reminder of us to put this in context as we bring the night to a close.
Sure. Can I just add, though, on Brigadier Grant's point about getting out into the communities, we should also remember that, as you mentioned earlier, the Northumberland Fusiliers, Norfolk Regiment, Border Regiment, A Brigade, things like that. If we're looking at the longer campaign from the 4th of June to the 12th, we should be looking at a United Kingdom-wide commemoration and try and hook those communities in as well. It'd be great to see that for next year, or certainly for the 85th. Anyway, I digress. Numbers. So we're looking at, by my calculations, and it's very difficult to find exact numbers here, but I think there's 8,000 men of the 51st were captured at St. Valerie, but I think 2,000 men were captured in the period before that. So that's a period that we were talking about just in the last talk there. So that's that 4th June to the 12th June, 11th June. Outside of St. Valerie, there's another 2,000. So that'll be 10,000 in total. Numbers of dead, I reckon it's about 850 to 1,000. So if you look at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database for numbers of people who died in France in Upper Normandy between 4th of June and 12th of June, it comes into about 850. But what you're not taking into consideration there is the men who were seriously wounded and evacuated back to Britain. So we know that wounded men were taken away from St. Valerie on the night of the 11th to 12th, and certainly the ones evacuated from the earlier battles, those horrendous casualties that 154 Brigade suffered. They would have been evacuated back. The seriously wounded would have been taken back to Britain. It might be as many as 1,000 killed. On the day itself, 12th of June, about 2,000 British troops were evacuated from Villarose and St. Valerie. I've been looking into this, funnily enough. It is the 2nd 7th Duke of Wellington's regiment, who had been the garrison. They were nearest that town, and the bulk of them managed to escape. Also, the 97th Kent Battery of one of the Field Artillery regiments, their commanding officer, you're talking about leadership, the commanding officer said, I'm getting my men out of there. But, you know, when they were told to return to the front line, when the ships didn't appear, he said, no, I'm marching along the beach, I'm going to find some ships. So there's about 2,000 troops there, but also 1,000 French. Now, this is peculiar because there was a chance at Le Havre, and the French didn't escape from there. They chose to surrender at Le Havre, as far as I can see. So those 1,000 who escaped from Villarose were desperate to get away. They obviously thought, we are going to die here. So that was quite unusual for that number of French. And then there was about 9,000. This is the number of troops who were evacuated from Le Havre. So that's a fairly substantial chunk. These are most of the troops. Most of them are about half of them are 51st, and certainly they will, if you're counting A Brigade as part of the large 51st. we're looking at about probably 15,000 troops escaping in total from Upper Normandy in June 1940, which is quite staggering because earlier in the campaign, there had been correspondence between the War Office and the 51st and the Admiralty, and they were looking at, say, 25,000 men. So Operation Cycle, the fleet that was organised was to pick up 25,000 men. The last signal, I think, that came out of St. Valery via Commander Elkins was saying we've got 20,000, about 10,000 British, about 10,000 French. So, you know, those numbers that are involved to get 15,000 men lifted and taken back. Eventually, the ones who went to Cherbourg were taking Operation Ariel a week later, evacuating back to Britain. But I'd say that was quite successful. We look at St. Valery's disaster, all these men who surrendered, but actually, you know, Operation Cycle, we can look at it as fairly successful because we're about 15,000 men away. And then the French numbers as well, I've got a little bit here. I reckon there's 9,000 French captured in St. Valery, but slightly fewer than them in the 51st. But before that, about 30,000 French, I reckon, were killed and captured. The whole corps, the French 9th Corps took the brunt of the German attack when we were looking about that sweep down the Rommel's Panzer Division that came round and took us on the western flank of St. Valery. They had cut through a colonial division that was part of 9th Corps and completely destroyed it. One of their regiments had, so a French regiment is 3 battalions strong, 1,800 men strong. After 3 days of fighting, they had 922 killed. So that's over 50% killed. They had another 792 wounded and captured. Effectively, the brigade was 150 strong because the Panzer divisions had absolutely gone through them. So in those few days before the surrender at St. Valery, the French had really taken just a hell of a beating, really, from the Panzer divisions and the French, the German infantry. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think I'm really good at that.
Those figures, and not only UK figures, but also French figures as well. Colleagues, friends, thank you very, very much for gathering for tonight's input. A number of thanks before we close specific individuals. Can we thank Major Owen Punter, who reached out on the back of the review of Tune Goodfield's work, and it was instrumental in kicking the ball round about the format of this evening. Thank you very much. Major Vicar, thank you very much for your technical support in advance of tonight and also on this evening. We couldn't have done it without you. Thank you to our assembled audience of brigade staff. We have a message from the commanding officer, Ben Wrench, who passes his very best to everyone who has been here tonight, and thanks all of those who have contributed to this evening. And on that note, can we again thank both Adam Brown and Brigadier Charles Grant for an absolute tour de force on this commemorative weekend of St. Valery. Thank you to everyone who engaged tonight, and I hope many of you will also watch the evening tribute concert as part of St. Valery commemorations. Good evening all, and thank you for your support once again.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you. If I can just pass on our thanks, obviously.